Tony Gosling, thanks for your patience there. Good to check back in with you, Tony. Hope you're safe and doing well out there in Bristol. Your thoughts on the story, Tony?
Well, to answer your question, I think it's quite clear that this is a deal which involves whatever the Foreign Office and the Iranian Foreign Office is saying, Foreign Minister is saying, that there has been some sort of deal struck here. And it could be that the impetus for that deal, the money for hostages if you want, but I mean, I think it's quite clear Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was not on holiday in Iran. Boris Johnson, now Prime Minister when he was Foreign Secretary, admitted it himself at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee a year after she was arrested. He said that she was there training journalists. Well, was that just a mistake, or was he repeating what he'd heard in MI6 briefings? I think it's pretty obvious that it wasn't just a holiday. And so if Nazanin was there training journalists rather than on holiday, then she was probably committing a crime. And so the thing is that it looks as if has been precipitated by a sudden change in Europe, which is the sanctions on Russia and the rocketing oil prices, and the British having to say, just as the Americans have had to say down in Venezuela, oh, sorry about all that regime change we were trying to institute. We need some oil, and we need it fast, and we need it cheap. And so that may have been what has precipitated this. It's also interesting, if you look at the other person released today, Anoosheh Ashoori, that he was spying for Israel. Well, I think we can say basically that a spy for Britain is a spy for Israel. We have this intelligence sharing agreement in the West, which is called the Five Eyes. And I'm going to let you into a secret. It's not Five Eyes, it's Six Eyes, because officially the Five Eyes is Britain, the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. But actually Israel is an integral part of that. It's just that they don't like admitting it. The evidence for this is absolutely clear. We do lots and lots of intelligence sharing with the Israelis. It's just that they don't like to be seen to be part of the Western Empire in intelligence terms. And it's absolutely clear that the Mossad, for example, is constantly working very closely with MI6. And in fact, here in the UK, we have these intelligence services even starting to get to the point where they believe now, a law was passed last year to say they are beyond the law and they can break the law with impunity, and even if a policeman catches them in the act of murder, that they will get off because they are above the law, which suggests to me, of course, that these intelligence services are really an enormous great protection racket, criminal gang, and that is why I think it is important that non-aligned countries, more neutral countries around the world, do take these sorts of cases quite seriously, where they find one of these intelligence operatives out there. Now, I'm not saying Nazanin was, perhaps he was just training journalists and perhaps it was innocent, but at the end of the day, it doesn't look as if, from what the Prime Minister now himself has said, that she was just on holiday.
And Professor, thank you there, Tony. Professor Alexander Ozarian, we have about 40 seconds left. Your final thoughts really quick, please.
I mean, the whole case reminds me of those four knuckleheads who were arrested in the western parts of Iran in the Zagros Mountains in 2009, claiming to be climbers. You put together Iranian British or British Iranian, whatever they want to call themselves, a trained journalist, and somebody whose the title is just a charity worker. The whole thing just doesn't add. And as far as all these contracts that were not fulfilled, let's not forget a lot of the F-16s that the Iranian F-16 jets that the Iranians didn't get, the Israelis end up having it, even using it against the Palestinians now. Were supposed to be sold to the Iranians, not to mention a couple of warships, one of which fired a missile at an Iranian passenger plane, a 747, and killed a bunch of innocent civilians. So I sense and I smell Israel all over this story. It's not that complicated, but I'm not their attorney. I'm not Nazanin or Anoosheh's attorney. I'm not defending what Iran did, but these cases are, again, very suspicious, especially if you're gonna, give another country which you're accusing of terrorism over $500 million.
All right, gentlemen, always a
problem is that they're doing it with their allies too, not paying for, basically not delivering the weapons that have been paid for. Right now, the Bulgarians have paid for a whole bunch of fighter jets from the United States, and they've just been told, no, you're not having them. And so we may have a similar case between the Bulgarian government and the US government in future years, because these fighter jets from the US haven't been delivered, even though they've been paid for.
All right, gentlemen, always a pleasure. Stay safe, both of you. Tony Gosling out of Bristol and Alexander Azargan joining us from Irvine, California. And viewers, that brings us to the end of your Press TV News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and bye-bye for now. Now welcome everyone to Press TV's News Review program, where we get in-depth in one of the day's top stories. Now, two British-Iranian nationals who served whole or part of their jail terms for espionage in Iran are on their way back to the United Kingdom after being released today. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was arrested in 2016 and subsequently sentenced to 5 years in prison for espionage. Later, she was sentenced to another year for anti-Iran propaganda. Anoosheh Ashoori, another British-Iranian, was also given conditional release because of his age and health. He was sentenced to 10 years in jail on charges of spying for Israel and acquiring illegal wealth. Ashoori served nearly half of his term. Meanwhile, London has settled the long overdue debt of $530 million to Tehran. Britain owed the amount it received from the former Pahlavi regime for military vehicles which were never delivered. The UK had been using different pretexts for the delay, including anti-Iran sanctions. Meanwhile, Iran says there is no link between London paying this overdue debt to Tehran and the release of the British-Iranian nationals. Comments were made by Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh. He said Iran and the UK signed an agreement last summer for the payment of London's debt, but the British government failed to live up to it. Khatibzadeh said that Iran released the two prisoners on the basis of Islamic leniency and humanitarian considerations. The officials stressed Iran has never backed down on its position on reclaiming the rights of its people. Khatibzadeh said after a delay of over 40 years, the British government has recently paid its debt following lengthy talks. He noted London used political issues as a pretext to avoid repaying the debt during all these years. Joining us now is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol, and Alexander Azargan, professor of international political economy, joining us from Irvine, California. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess we'll start there in sunny Southern California with you, Alexander. I hope you're safe and doing well. Your thoughts on the release of these two and the fact that Tehran has emphasized twice now today that it has nothing to do with the $530 million that the Brits had for for over 43 years.
It's good to be with you, Danny, and our global audience. The thing that stands out is, why would the British government pay over $500 million for what you're told, is a charity worker in the case of Nazanin Zaghari, and in the case of Anoosheh Ashoori, we were told that, she was an ex-civil engineer. That right there and then should alarm us into looking into this, from a perspective of investigative journalists. But this story really has all the hallmarks of a Tom Clancy international espionage novel. It is basically, from our perspective in the U.S., it was a debt settlement case, like you were saying. The UK settled the historic debt owed by themselves to Iran. It was an international, this company called the International Military Services, apparently a key sticking point for Iran during all these negotiations. Most people haven't heard of this organization. It's a firm. IMS is a firm that at one point was one of the biggest arms dealers in the UK. It was nicknamed Margaret Thatcher's Merchant of Death. And in the early 1970s, like you were mentioning, IMS was used by the British government to sell UK weaponry overseas. Now here's where it gets interesting. It has subsidiaries in Iran, India, and Saudi Arabia. And the Shah of Iran became IMS's biggest customer. Most people don't know that. But basically what distinguished IMS was the collision of arbitration, politics, and sanctions. And these arbitrations started as a contractual dispute and over time morphed into a symbol of something else, which is what you and I and your other guests are discussing. It basically came down to this. Iran, like you were mentioning, got into an agreement with IMS to buy the British, the famous Chieftain tanks and an armored recovery vehicle. Then the Iranian Revolution happened on February 22nd, if I'm correct, and these contracts were terminated around February 6th. So, you know, you mentioned the arms for prisons and what have you. This, I think, one of the reasons this is really, perhaps from a symbolic perspective, is sensitive to the Iranians is that they're going to go back to around the time of the revolution for all the debt that Iran was owed, and trying to settle that, perhaps diplomatically. You know, everything is symbolic for diplomats. So we'll have to see where we go from here. But obviously, the narrative in the West is hostages for money.
Thank you, Professor.